Right now, inside your walls, something is slowly happening. Not a leak, not mold, something quieter. Something most people never think about until their energy bills hit triple digits and they still can't figure out why their house feels like a furnace in July. The answer has been sitting in rural Pennsylvania for over 2 centuries. And the people who discovered it didn't use a single piece of modern insulation. They used straw, a $5 bale of straw. And the houses they built with it are still standing today, staying cooler in summer and warmer in winter than most modern homes that cost $500,000 to build. That's not a metaphor. That is a measurable, documented, verified fact. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why and exactly how they did it. Here's the thing nobody tells you when you move into a modern home. Your walls are designed by committee, not by builders who live in houses, not by people who pay their own energy bills. They're designed by industry panels, insulation manufacturers, and building code committees, many of whom have a financial reason to sell you more material, more complexity, and more ongoing dependence. What they don't want you to think about is the physics. Because once you understand the physics, the whole modern approach starts to look a little embarrassing. Let's start with what's actually happening inside your wall right now. A standard American wall built after 1970 typically looks like this from the outside in. Vinyl siding or brick cladding on the outside, then a thin layer of house wrap or felt paper, then OSB or plywood sheathing, then a stud cavity, usually 2x4 or 2x6 framing, packed with fiberglass batt insulation, then a vapor barrier, then drywall, then paint. 7 layers. 7 layers? And most homes still fail basic thermal performance tests. Why? Because fiberglass insulation, the pink fluffy stuff in the walls of nearly every home built in America since the 1950s, has a dirty secret. It doesn't actually stop heat from moving through your wall. It slows it down. And that sounds fine until you realize that in a properly designed wall, you don't want the heat to slow down inside the wall cavity at all. You want the wall itself to either reflect heat away or absorb and release it at the right time. Fiberglass does neither. What fiberglass does is trap heat inside the wall while it slowly works its way through. In summer, your walls store that heat like a slow cooker and radiate it back into your home all night long, even after the sun goes down. In winter, moisture condenses inside the wall cavity because the temperature differential between warm inside air and cold outside air creates a dew point somewhere in the middle of your insulation. Wet fiberglass barely insulates at all. This is not a fringe theory. This is standard building science. It's in the textbooks. The problem is, the textbooks also recommend fiberglass, because that's what the industry sells. Now here's where the Amish come in. And I want you to understand something about them before we go further. They are not anti-technology. That's a misconception. What they are is deeply skeptical of technology that creates dependency. Dependency on the grid. Dependency on supply chains. Dependency on products they can't make themselves. When they build a house, they ask a completely different question than a modern contractor asks. A modern contractor asks, what does the code require? An Amish builder asks, what does the house need to do? That second question leads to radically different answers. 200 years ago, Amish communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana were building with a material so abundant it was literally left over from the harvest. Straw. Not hay, straw. This distinction matters enormously, and most people get it wrong. Hay is dried grass, still full of seeds and plant matter. You don't build with hay. Straw is the hollow stalks left behind after grain has been harvested. Wheat straw, rye straw, barley straw. What's left is a hollow tube structure, almost like a bundle of tiny drinking straws. And that hollow tube structure is one of the most thermally efficient shapes in nature. Air trapped inside hollow tubes cannot convect. It cannot move. And heat transfer through still trapped air is extraordinarily slow. This is the same principle behind a down jacket, behind a thermos, behind the insulating layer of fat on an Arctic seal. The thermal resistance of a standard straw bale wall is somewhere between R30 and R35. A standard modern 2x6 wall with fiberglass insulation achieves R19 on a good day. And that's before thermal bridging. Through the studs drops the real-world effective R value to around R14 or R15. A wall made from leftover crop waste that costs almost nothing achieves more than double the thermal resistance of a standard American wall system. And it has been doing this for centuries. But here's what makes it even more interesting. Thermal mass. R value is only half the story of how a wall performs. R value tells you how fast heat moves through a wall. Thermal mass tells you how much heat a wall can absorb and store before it starts letting that heat through. A high thermal mass wall doesn't just slow heat down, it delays it. Think about how heat moves through a desert landscape. The sand heats up quickly in the morning sun, but deep underground, it stays cool for hours. A wall with high thermal mass works the same way. The outside face heats up during the day, but the inside face stays cool because the wall is storing that heat. By the time stored heat travels through to the inside, hours have passed. Ideally, the heat arrives at the inside face at night, when outside temperatures have dropped and you're sleeping. This is called the thermal flywheel effect. And it is one of the oldest and most elegant principles in building science. Straw bale walls have extraordinary thermal mass. The thick walls, typically 18 inches or more, mean the delay time between outside heat and inside heat arrival can be 10 to 12 hours. In practical terms, the hottest day of summer hits the outside of your wall at 2 p.m. The inside of your wall doesn't feel that heat until 2 a.m., at which point you open a window, the cool night air flushes out the heat, and you reset the cycle for the next day. No air conditioning required. That is what happens in well-documented straw bale homes in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Southern Europe. Now let's talk about the objections: fire, moisture. These are the two things that end the conversation in most circles. Both are mostly myths, but they contain enough truth to be worth taking seriously. Start with fire. A bale of straw stacked loosely in a barn burns. Everyone knows that, but that's not how straw bale walls work. In a finished straw bale wall, the bales are compressed tightly and then covered on both sides with a thick plaster render, lime plaster or earthen plaster, typically 2 to 3 inches thick. This plaster coat is dense and non-combustible. When fire testing organizations have tested finished straw bale wall panels, a finished straw bale wall consistently achieved a 1 hour or greater fire rating, the same as conventional 2x4 framing with fiberglass and drywall. There are straw bale homes in California, Nevada, and New Mexico, some of the highest fire risk areas on Earth, that survived wildfires while neighboring conventionally built homes burned to the ground. That is documented. Now moisture, the more nuanced concern. Straw is an organic material. Get it wet and keep it wet, and it will eventually rot. But here's what people miss. The design of a proper straw bale wall makes sustained moisture contact almost impossible. The walls are thick. They breathe. Lime plaster and earthen plaster are vapor permeable, meaning moisture that gets in can also get out. Compare this to a conventional wall with a polyethylene vapor barrier. That barrier is designed to stop moisture from entering. But when moisture gets past it anyway, through cracks and imperfections, and it always does, that moisture has nowhere to go. It's trapped. Trapped moisture against wood framing and OSB is where you get catastrophic mold problems. The modern wall tries to keep moisture out with a single rigid barrier. The straw bale wall manages moisture by breathing, by drying, by never creating a sealed cavity where moisture accumulates. The building science community has been documenting this for 30 years. Here's a number that will change how you look at your utility bill. The average American household spends $1,200 to $2,200 per year on home heating and cooling. In extreme climates, Phoenix, Houston, Minnesota, Maine, it can run $3,000 or more per year. Over 30 years, that's $36,000 to $90,000 in energy costs. Documented straw bale homes in comparable climates report annual energy bills that are 50 to 75% lower, not 10% lower, half. Some of the most well-designed straw bale homes report near-zero heating bills in climates that would normally cost thousands per year. The material that makes this possible costs approximately $5 per bale. A standard 1,500 square foot home requires somewhere between 200 and 300 bales. That's $1,000 to $1,500 in raw material cost for the entire wall insulation system. Compare that to the spray foam, rigid foam boards, and specialized vapor barriers of a high-performance modern wall, which can run $15,000 to $40,000 for the same house. The economics become almost absurd. But the story of why we stopped building this way is more interesting than the building method itself. Straw bale construction wasn't just an Amish practice. In the late 1800s, when European settlers moved into the treeless Great Plains of Nebraska and the Dakotas, they faced an immediate problem. There was no lumber. The land was flat, the climate was brutal, -20 in winter, over 100 in summer, and the only building material available in abundance was prairie grass. Out of pure necessity, settlers started building with straw bales. The Nebraska sandhills became the birthplace of what historians call the Nebraska-style straw bale house. These weren't rough shelters. They were real homes, solid, thick-walled, beautifully plastered structures that stayed warm through prairie winters so cold that cattle died in the fields. Church buildings, schoolhouses, dance halls, all built from straw bales. Some of these structures are still standing today, over 130 years old, structurally sound, still occupied. One of the oldest is the Pilgrim Holiness Church in Arthur, Nebraska, built in 1928 from straw bales, still in use, still standing. Then something changed. In the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government began aggressively standardizing building codes. The insulation industry was young but growing. Fiberglass insulation had been invented in 1932, accidentally, when a stream of high-pressure air struck a stream of molten glass and produced fibers. By the 1940s, the major insulation manufacturers were lobbying to have fiberglass written into building codes as the default standard. They succeeded. Straw bale construction was not made illegal, nothing so dramatic. It was simply written out of approved methods. Building inspectors wouldn't approve it. Banks wouldn't finance it. Insurance companies wouldn't cover it. By 1960, straw bale construction had all but disappeared from mainstream American building. And the knowledge, the specific know-how about bale sizing, plaster application, moisture management, began to quietly vanish from the culture, except in the communities that never adopted modern building codes in the first place. Except among the Amish. When Old Order Amish communities build homes, they operate under a different framework entirely. They are not subject to most municipal building codes. They don't finance construction through banks. They don't need insurance companies to approve their methods. And so they kept building with straw and with timber and with earth and plaster, exactly as their grandparents had. Not out of stubbornness, out of wisdom. They watched their neighbors build expensive houses that leaked heat, accumulated moisture damage, and required constant mechanical intervention to stay comfortable. And they continued building houses that worked without any of that. There's a community in Holmes County, Ohio, the largest Amish settlement in the world, where older farmhouses built in the 1800s are still the most comfortable structures on the property. Visitors consistently remark on it. The old houses feel stable. They don't get hot in summer the way newer structures do. They don't feel drafty in winter. The temperature inside fluctuates far less than the temperature outside. Thick walls, natural plaster, proper roof overhang, windows on the right sides. These principles are embedded in the building tradition, passed down through observation and practice across generations. Meanwhile, outside those communities, building science researchers started to rediscover the same principles from the other direction. In the 1970s, the oil crisis made energy efficiency suddenly urgent. Researchers began measuring the actual thermal performance of existing building systems. What they found was uncomfortable. Modern homes, built to code with proper insulation, were performing far below theoretical predictions. The fiberglass was absorbing moisture and losing effectiveness. Thermal bridging through the studs was creating invisible pathways for heat. Vapor barriers were trapping moisture in exactly the wrong places. The whole system was leaking energy through 100 tiny failure modes, none dramatic enough to be obvious, all adding up to overall performance that was dismal compared to what the textbook numbers promised. At the same time, a researcher named David Bainbridge in New Mexico began documenting surviving straw bale structures from the Nebraska era. What he found matched the thermodynamics exactly. These structures were performing far above what modern insulation achieved, not because straw is magic, because the physics work. The data was unambiguous. In 1993, a nonprofit called the California Straw Building Association was founded. In 1996, researchers and builders published the first systematic technical guide to straw bale construction since the Nebraska era. That same year, Tucson, Arizona, became one of the first cities in the country to formally include straw bale construction in its building code, not as an experimental variance, as a legitimate standard method. That decision changed something. One of the most important tests in this modern revival was documented by a group of homeowners in Tucson over 5 years. Their 800 square foot straw bale home, annual energy bills, annual temperature data. The house had no central air conditioning. In a city where summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 5 years, the interior temperature varied between 68 and 78 degrees, entirely passively, on days when the outside temperature swung between 65 and 112 degrees, a 47-degree temperature swing outside, a 10-degree temperature swing inside, no mechanical system, no air conditioning, no forced air heating, just thick walls, proper design, and the physics of thermal mass. The energy industry noticed, not in a good way. Between 2005 and 2015, a wave of lobbying pushed back against alternative building methods in state legislatures across the country. Industry groups representing fiberglass and spray foam manufacturers began funding research that emphasized the risks of organic building materials. Fire, moisture, pest intrusion. The studies were real, but selectively designed. They tested straw bale walls in conditions no builder would actually use. Unplastered, unprotected, exposed to sustained water intrusion. Then published the results as though they were applicable to properly built finished walls. The point isn't that industry groups are evil. The point is that there are billions of dollars in ongoing insulation sales at stake. A building method that requires almost no purchased materials and lasts over a century without replacement is not good for that business model. The passive house movement, one of the most rigorous energy efficiency certification systems in the world, developed in Germany in the 1990s, has certified dozens of straw bale homes. Passive house certification requires that a building consume 90% less energy for heating and cooling than a typical comparable building. In Europe, where straw bale construction never fully disappeared, builders found that straw bale walls could hit passive house thermal targets with minimal additional technology. The walls are just that good. There are certified passive house straw bale homes in Germany, Austria, France, and the UK, built for costs comparable to or lower than conventional construction. In 2019, a family in rural Vermont tore down a deteriorating 1970s ranch house that was costing them $4,800 per year to heat. They rebuilt on the same footprint using a timber frame structure and filled with straw bales covered in lime plaster with deep roof overhangs. Total wall cost for the straw bale system, approximately $6,200. First winter energy bill, $340, not $340 per month. $340 for the entire heating season in Vermont, where winter temperatures regularly drop below zero. They've published their energy bills for 5 consecutive years. The highest annual total was $410. Their neighbors, in comparable houses with conventional construction, consistently spend between $3,800 and $5,200 per heating season. The straw bale family paid for their entire wall system in energy savings within 2 years. After that, it's pure savings, year after year for the lifetime of the house. Now here's where we come back to you, back to your walls, back to your house, back to your utility bill. You probably don't have the option to tear down your house and rebuild it with straw bales, but the principles that make straw bale work, thermal mass, vapor permeable surfaces, thick walls, proper orientation, can be applied partially to existing homes. Exterior insulation applied over existing wall surfaces eliminates thermal bridging through studs entirely. It moves the dew point to outside the wall assembly, preventing the moisture condensation problems that destroy fiberglass from the inside. Natural lime plaster applied over interior surfaces adds meaningful thermal mass and allows the wall to breathe. Roof overhangs, or simple exterior shading structures on south and west-facing windows, can cut solar heat gain in summer by 60 to 70%, which has more impact than most insulation upgrades. None of these interventions are revolutionary. All of them are rooted in principles the Amish never stopped using. Globally, enough crop straw is produced each year to house every person on Earth several times over. Most of it is burned in the fields. Burning straw releases carbon. Building with straw sequesters carbon, locking the CO2 the plant absorbed during growth into the wall of your house, where it stays for the lifetime of the building. A straw bale home doesn't just use less energy, it stores carbon. Research from the University of Bath has consistently found that a straw bale wall has a negative carbon footprint over its lifetime, meaning it removes more carbon from the atmosphere than was emitted producing and constructing it. A conventional fiberglass and OSB wall has a strongly positive carbon footprint, a building material that makes the house work better and makes the climate better at the same time. And we stopped using it because a company that made glass fibers wanted to sell insulation. The Amish don't think of themselves as environmental pioneers. They don't frame their building practices in terms of carbon footprints or passive house metrics. They frame it in terms of stewardship. You take care of what you've been given. You build to last. You don't use more than you need. You don't create a dependence you can't sustain. These principles, applied to construction, produce buildings that coincidentally align almost perfectly with what 21st century building science says we should be doing. Not accidentally, because the principles are correct. The physics hasn't changed in 200 years. The thermal properties of a hollow tube of straw haven't changed. What changed was the economic incentive structure around how we build. The knowledge was never lost. It was preserved in communities that never agreed to give it up. Preserved in the farmhouses of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana. In buildings that outlasted the companies that tried to replace them. In walls that kept people warm through 100 winters while the modern walls next door rotted from trapped moisture and hemorrhaged heat through thermal bridges nobody calculated. The Amish didn't reinvent anything. They just refused to forget. And what they refused to forget turns out to be more thermally efficient, more durable, more sustainable, and more economical than what replaced it. The $5 bale of straw sitting in a field after the harvest. The thing that modern construction decided was too simple, too old, too unsophisticated to take seriously. It was never the walls that failed. It was always the thinking. And the thinking can be changed, starting with understanding exactly what is happening inside your walls right now and what could be happening instead.